Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 8th NParks 1 Million Trees webinar. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and on YouTube today. I'm Botanic, and it is my honor to be hosting all of you this afternoon. So we've been planting trees for over a year now, and we are close to hitting the 1/4 mark of the 1 million trees that we aim to plant. But aside from planting trees, the 1 Million Trees movement also comprises of online activities, just like this one, webinars like this, virtual tours for everyone to learn from the safety and comfort of your home. So do check out our website, trees.sg, and follow us on our NParks social media channels for updates. This weekend, we are also celebrating the Festival of Biodiversity. So do check out the array of activities that we have planned for all of you. Ms. Estin will be sharing the relevant links on the Zoom chat below. Now, I'm sure that many of us appreciate the greenery here that we have here in Singapore, especially so for those of you who are here today. But not many may know that our green spaces are actually made up of a wide range of different vegetation types. And far fewer understand the nuanced differences between these many shades of green. But not to worry, our speakers here today are experts on this topic. Joining us, we have Dr. Chong Kwek Yan from the Singapore Botanic Gardens and Dr. Norman Lim from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. Together, we will discover the differences between different vegetation types within Singapore's forests and learn about the ecological principles of conserving them. So after they are done sharing, we have a short Q&A sessions. So if you have any questions along the way, do send them to Rachel as a private message using the Zoom chat function. With so many shades of green to talk about, I will not hold back our speakers. Kwek Yan, over to you, please.
Thanks for watching. Just let me share my screens. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kwek Yan, and I'm a forest ecologist at NParks. So for today's sharing, I would first give an overview on the different shades of green that we have in Singapore, focusing specifically on natural vegetation and our forests. And then because I would have talked a lot about the plants, I would hand over to Norman, who will then tell you more about the animals in the forest. So first of all, what do we mean when we say vegetation? By vegetation, we refer to all the plants in an area as a whole. Vegetation not just includes the tall trees, but also the climbers that climb on the trees, the shorter trees, the shrubs, as well as the non-woody plants such as grasses. So depending on climate, soil, and also disturbances such as floods, fires, landslides, animals, or human activities, certain plant species can dominate an area, leading to what we call vegetation types. Most broadly speaking, vegetation types can range from grasslands dominated by grasses to scrublands, which have some woody plants, to open woodlands where there are more trees, and then to forests where the crowns of the trees are close enough to form a continuous canopy. So Singapore is situated near the equator in the tropics, and in the tropics where the temperatures are warm and rainfall is abundant all year round, climatic conditions are actually very good for plant growth and tree growth and the formation of woody tree tissue. The natural vegetation that you get in this part of the world very naturally would be the tropical rainforest. So if you imagine in 1819, when Stamford Raffles sailed into the mouth of the Singapore River to begin setting up the port of Singapore, at that time, most of Singapore would have been covered by a lush jungle that is the tropical rainforest. But within 20 years, just after setting up the port of Singapore, many inroads were made into the interior of the island, and large areas of the forest had already been converted to plantations. And most of these plantations were actually pepper, which is one of the important spices in trade at that time, and gambia, which after harvesting is boiled, and then the chemicals, the extract is actually used to cure leather, right? And after 60 years, so this is close to the end of the 19th century, already 90% of the original forest cover that was there had already been gone. The British then commissioned a study to look at the remaining forests, draw up where they are, and then propose a plan to gazette the various remaining forests left as forest reserves, and so that you can protect and manage what is left. So By the middle of the 20th century, while we were still under colonial rule, these forest reserves were actually eventually revoked, although Bukit Timah was very quickly reinstated and the forests around the reservoir were always under some kind of protection in order to safeguard the water supply in the reservoir and the water quality in the reservoir. This is what Singapore looks like today, right? Most of our natural forests, naturally because of historical developments, is concentrated within the central parts of Singapore as well as the western parts of Singapore. Of these forests, the reality is that very little is the original forest that was here 200 years ago, or what we would call primary forest. So by primary forest, we refer to the original vegetation that is in a particular place. And in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, around Malaysia, Sumatra, and Kalimantan, the original tropical rainforests are actually dominated by a family of trees called the dipterocarps, which were very valuable for that timber. Today, you can still find dipterocarps in bits of primary rainforest that we have left in Singapore, such as in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, as in the photograph that you see here. And if you read in books about tropical rainforests, you may have read about how there are different layers in the forest. All these layers arise because of the combination of excellent climatic conditions for growth, as well as the competition for light between the trees. So under this situation, the trees form a very dense and almost continuous canopy of leaves. But under this canopy, there's very, very little light. So only plants that can tolerate the low light conditions can persist on the forest floor and below the canopy, which we call the subcanopy. But some trees can actually manage to grow beyond the canopy layer and they poke out above this canopy. And we call these the emergents. So here's a top-down view of the canopy at the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. And among these, you might be able to catch some of the dipterocarp trees, which are poking out, or they're forming the canopy layer in this photograph, right? A very special feature of the dipterocarp forest in this part of the world, which is very different from tropical rainforests in other parts of the world, is that they all participate in flowering and they produce fruit every few years, usually following an unusually dry period, usually in what we call an El Nino year. So between these dry periods, the trees will store up all their resources. And then when the whole forest is in reproduction, they will flood the forest floor with all their seeds. And this is suggested to be a way of ensuring that at least some of the seeds will escape being eaten by animals so that they can survive and grow and become the next generation of trees. So besides Bukit Timah, where there is the largest patch of primary dipterocarp forest left in Singapore today, because of the almost continuous protection against logging, there are also dipterocarp trees scattered around various parts of the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, most of them around the MacRitchie Reservoir area. And there is also dipterocarp rainforest that has been kept relatively intact within the Singapore Botanic Gardens. The rest of the Central Catchment Nature Reserve that has been protected as a municipal water catchment in the colonial days consists today of what we call secondary forests, which is forest that is in the process of regeneration after disturbances such as logging and past agriculture. This is most of the forests that you would see when you walk along the trails or along boardwalks around our reservoirs. Those are secondary forests. And while these forests are not as diverse as what you see in the primary forests of the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, they are nonetheless, many species which we call native, meaning that they were originally here in the forests of Singapore. Some key groups of species that you might see in our native-dominated secondary forests, one of them will be Calophyllum, which can be very easily recognized. If you look at this photograph, you will see very many fine veins that are running parallel to each other on the leaf blade. Or the Garcinias, which are relatives of the mangosteen that we eat. And many species of Garcinia are actually even eaten and planted in the kampong and villages of the old days, in addition to being eaten by forest animals. Here are what we call the Eleocarpus, or oil fruits. And here are the Syzygium, which are closely related to your jambu or rose apple. And each of these four groups of plants, they contain many species which can be difficult to tell apart, but the groups are very easy to identify. And anyone can actually learn to identify these groups. And once you can identify the Calophyllums, the Garcinias, the Eleocarpus, and the Syzygium, you can easily show off and say that you can recognize about half of the trees in our native dominated secondary forest. But that also shows you that it is, in a sense, less diverse than the primary tropical rainforest. But there is one kind of secondary forest which still consists of native species, but it is even lower in diversity. And this is called the Edinandra beluga. Edinandra referring to the single species that makes up most of the trees in this forest, known as Edinandra dumosa, or the common name is called tube tube. And beluga, the word beluga is actually the Malay word for scrubland or secondary forest. So the reason why the Edinandra beluga is so poor in diversity is because of soil that is heavily degraded by past destructive gambia and pepper agriculture in the past. So only a few species can tolerate this poor soil, which aside from tube tube includes some species which actually might be very familiar to those who have served in the army and had the pleasure of bashing through rasam ferns or standing around making bad jokes about simple eye with its large leaves and distinctive leaf stalk. Some parks in Singapore actually consist of Edinandra beluga, and this will include Kent Park and Telok Blangah Hill Park. And finally, there are the secondary forests, which are not dominated by native species, but instead are actually dominated by plants which were brought into Singapore from elsewhere, usually through past agriculture or as breeds. And we call these exotic species or non-native species. And many of them cause problems, and they're considered invasive species in other parts of the world. Examples of plants that you would see in exotic dominated vegetation will include the albizia tree, which is this super fast growing tree from Sulawesi, which can grow 20 meters tall in just 4 to 5 years and reach 30 meters in just 10 years. And 30 meters is very close to the height of the canopy trees that you see in primary tropical rainforest. Because they grow so fast, though, unlike the Dipterocarp trees, which grow very slowly and build up their wood very slowly, albizia trees tend to have very weak wood, and this weak wood breaks easily. So this is why albizia trees can actually pose a safety hazard especially when there's human or vehicular traffic or property nearby. So NParks managers will have to remove these trees for public safety. In exotic dominated forests, you also find some formal plantation trees, such as rubber trees from Brazil. Rubber plantations at some point in time in Singapore's history covered probably about half or more than half of Singapore. So although I say that these plant species are exotic, or some of these forests are maybe not so diverse, these vegetation types are still home to many animals, and these animals would pass through these forests. These animals will forage in these forests and look for food in these forests, and are habitats for these animals. So now that I've talked to you so much about the plants, what I'll do next is I will hand over to Norman to tell you more about the forest animals. Norman, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kwek Yan. Okay, let me get my screen on. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Norman Lim, and I'm a lecturer at NIE NTU. So after hearing about the vegetation from what Kwek Yan has shared, I tried to bring in the link between the forest and the animals. As Kwek Yan has shared, the forests are really the main terrestrial habitats for our region. And as a result, you imagine that many of our native animals are really adapted to this forest condition. And so you can imagine that the importance of forests for our animals can come through many forms. And one of them is really from the perspective of day-to-day activities, like them using the forest as a shelter, so habitats, and even as a source of food. But there can also be certain special occasions where the forests are important. For example, when the animals undergo courtship behavior or for reproduction events. So I try to illustrate this through two local examples, two local species that we have, the Sunda pangolin and the Sunda Colugo. So first off, the pangolin. Pangolins are found in this order called Pholidota. There are 8 species of them, 4 in Asia, 4 in Africa. And if you're not familiar with how they look like, in this screenshot here, you can see the pangolin, the actual animal, on the bottom right. And it's really unusual looking, covered with scales, which is also why they're called scaly anteater. And their unusual looks have inspired the creation of a sandshrew Pokemon. And within Singapore, the species that we have is the Manis javanica. Here in the map of Singapore, you can see the red crosses. You will notice that these red crosses, which are actually the locations of past records of pangolin, they are clustered around the central catchment area and also on the western catchment area. So these are the two main patches that Kwek Yan mentioned that they are the main vegetated areas that we have. So I went into the study of pangolin really at a time when they were starting to be trafficked. And in fact, by the time now, they are really acknowledged to be one of the most trafficked animal, if not the most. And in Singapore, we actually have seen transshipments of pangolin scales coming through Singapore as well. And the picture, which was also taken from Straits Times, are pictures of the pangolin scales from Nigeria, and they were bound for Vietnam. So how do we study pangolins in the wild? The unfortunate thing about studying pangolins in the wild is that pangolins are known to be highly elusive. And people who have gone into the forest on a regular basis, they actually rarely encounter, if at all. So being such an elusive animal is actually quite difficult to study them. And for research, we actually require the animals to be reliably found again. And to do that, we make use of common technique called radiotelemetry. And just a quick introduction about this method. Essentially, it is the placement of radio transmitters on the animal itself. One main consideration is that the tag itself or the transmitter should be weighing less than 3% of the body weight for the animal. So this is to ensure that the animal are not burdened by these transmitters that we put on them. And there are so many methods of attachment, and this really depends on the animal. So on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the typical usage, which is attachment as a collar. And then on the left-hand side, bottom left, we have the tag, which is directly glued on to the back of the animal itself, in this case, a bat. So transmitters are really small, and some of the smallest animals that I know about are actually dragonflies that has been tagged with a transmitter that's obviously less than 1 gram. So that's on the animal side. And on the researcher side, we have to get hold of a radio receiver, and together with a directional antenna, then we can find out where's the animal, or essentially where's the tag. So back to the pangolins. The pangolin is a really unusual animal. So as you can see from this image here, they have a very conical shaped head. And this results in them not really having a very defined neck, which is a constriction as we move from the tip of the snout towards the body. So as a result, if you use the usual type of transmitters for mammals, which is a collar, the unfortunate thing is that the collar will just slip off the head of the pangolin whenever it lowers its head. So as a result, another consideration is that we do not use a harness. A harness is another way of attachment, but because the pangolin moves through really dense vegetation, and wearing a harness just increases the chance that the animal might get caught in the dense vegetation and then be trapped there. So it is deemed to be too risky, and we do not make use of harness. And ultimately, the method used is really just the attachment of the transmitter onto the loose ends of a tail scale. And this has been successfully done for African pangolins, and we replicated that for the local species. So for this work on the pangolins, the research objectives were really quite broad. We tried to understand more about its basic ecology. So these include things like the home range size, activity cycle, which part of the day is the animal actually active? Is it the daytime or nighttime? What type of prey do they go for? What type of habitat do they make use of? And anything that's useful for the conservation. Bear in mind that it was during a time where they were starting to be trafficked a lot. And here's a quick summary about the findings. So for the attachment method that was used, we attached directly to the tail scale. Unfortunately, there was a high dropout rates for the transmitters. So out of the 20 plus male pangolins that I tagged, I only had good data for 4 of them. So through the tracking and all the observation, because I was able to follow them pretty near to them, like maybe about 15, 20 meters away, I could find out that the pangolins are actually solitary animals. They don't really hang out in groups. The average home range for adult males are about 40 hectares. They lead a very good life in the sense that they're only active for 4 hours, which means they are sleeping or resting for 20 hours a day. So here is a plot showing the activity of 4 different pangolins, and each of them having a different color. So for the 4 pangolins, they actually space themselves out during the night. Some were active earlier in the night, some were actually active in the middle of the night, and some later of the night. The pangolins were also sleeping on trees, but they were really adaptable in the sense that they also make use of some human structures like drains and abandoned buildings, and they could be sleeping in such locations. And they fed on many species of ants and termites. And ants and termites are really found everywhere, be it in the forests, in the grasslands, or even in the more urban areas. So diet wasn't a big limiting factor for them. And in terms of habitat, they were found foraging in the forests, the plantations, and even the semi-urban areas. So it seems like, based on the above, the pangolins are really adaptable species. They don't seem to require very unusual requirements, which makes them important to conserve. The issue then is, what could we take away and then make use of for the conservation of these species? So along the way, there was an unexpected find. So a pangolin female was actually tagged. And the unusual thing was that it stayed in the burrow consecutively for a few nights. So this was really unusual because all the pangolins that I've tagged and followed, they always come out on a nightly basis for foraging. So being an unusual encounter, so I placed a camera trap at the entrance of the burrow. And this was one of the images that we got after the few nights. And if you pay close attention to it, and I'll highlight it here. So the circle that's in red actually shows the mother pangolin with actually a young pangolin. So quite likely that the female pangolin was actually in the burrow and was giving birth during this period of time. And thankfully, the transmitter is still attached onto the mother. So we are able to trace it to its nest and also even other nests that it was using. So other camera traps were placed at the other locations as well. So this allowed me to capture more information concerning the use of dens and also their activity. And here we have pictures of the mother pangolin and the young at different locations. And we know that the pangolins were largely using tree hollows, which are associated with big trees. So here we have the one example of a den where the tree that we see here is really hollow at the base, and then the entrance is through the base of the tree. And for another location, it is a tree that had actually fallen over. And at the base of the roots area, which is the top right-hand panel, there's actually a small entrance where the pangolin squeezed through to get into the middle of the tree trunk, which is again hollow. So with the compilation of these 3 different dens that were used by the female pangolin, we actually recorded the characteristics of these trees. And the most important factor or information that we gathered concerning conservation will be this. So what we recorded is that DBH, which stands for diameter at breast height for the trees that are involved, they were all above 50 cm diameter. And this means that pangolins really require big trees during the reproduction phase. And that is good reason for us to conserve the mature forest for this endangered species. So in the nature, in the forest, tree hollows are actually quite hard to come by, really because tree hollows tend to be formed only for big trees. And big trees, we tend not to find too many of them. So if you're interested in this research work, feel free to look up this paper. It is publicly available online. And next up, I'll move to the Colugos. So the Colugos are also known as flying lemur, but it's really a misnomer. This is really because it doesn't fly. True animal that actually exhibits true flight would be like a bat or the birds. But in this case, the Colugo really just do gliding. And it's also not a lemur, which is one of the members of the primate group. Instead, the Colugos are placed in this particular order called Demoptera, which means skin wing. And there are only 2 species which are recognized in the world currently. And the one we have is of this species called Galopterus variegatus. The group of Colugos have the most extensive gliding membrane of all the gliders, and this allows them to glide about up to 150 meters between trees. And you can see from the image on the bottom right that the gliding membrane extends from the neck to the tip of the fingers and all the way to the tip of the tail. And what prompted this research is really the observation that for many of the mammal guidebooks in the literature, they state that Colugos occurs in plantations, parks, and gardens. But this was not what I sort of encountered here in Singapore, where we only see Colugos in the nature reserves. So here we have videos contributed by Zestin, and you can see the amazing gliding ability of the Colugo. So just one more time. Okay, so to do the research and to find out what type of habitats do the Colugo require, I did visual surveys in forest patches where Colugos are found in Singapore. And I recorded their occurrence in 200-meter long transects and collected information about the vegetation parameters for each of those 200-meter long transects. So things like DBH and also the amount of canopy cover. And then for data analysis, essentially it is trying to correlate the amount of Colugo seen, which is their occurrence, with also the vegetation parameters. Does it mean that they occur more in places where there are high DBH, etc.? So this is published in the paper here found in Mammalian Biology if you're interested. And the results. The main results was that the amount of canopy cover explained the occurrence of Colugos in Singapore. And this is illustrated through the plot that we have here. On the y-axis, this is the number of Colugos seen in each of the transect. And then on the x-axis is the amount of canopy cover. And we can see that, let me just bring up the laser pointer. So you can see that for much of the canopy cover, even reaching up to close to 90% canopy cover, Colugos were largely not seen. And they only start to rise up once we pass 90+% canopy cover. So this sort of goes against the observation that we see in the mammal guidebooks that they are found in plantations, parks, and gardens. And I do suspect that those locations where they are reported from could be adjacent to mature forest patches. And Colugos being rather mobile species, they tend to move around quite easily. As we have seen from the video just now, they can really glide quite long distances. And this allows them to be present in some of the neighboring vegetation. And probably these vegetation patches are more open, and this allows for people to see them more easily. Not many people actually want to go into a forest at night, right? So just thinking back into this idea of habitat connectivity, we know that both species that I've shared with, they exhibit the selection for large trees and also high amounts of canopy cover. And this should remind you of the primary forest and the old growth native dominated forest that Kwek Yan has shared just now. So this allows us to identify the crucial habitat types that are required by the respective species. So this step is an important first step for us to think about before we embark on enhancing habitat connectivity. So we need to know which are the important habitats for them before we can map them and conserve them to serve as wildlife corridors. So just one last slide, and this is to sort of do an advertisement for the understudied species that we have in Singapore. So tropical forests in general, they are really understudied, and this include mammals, which is probably the most well-studied group of all the organisms out there. And there are still lots of discoveries to be made. And modern technology can really help us a lot. To illustrate that, this is a record of Malay civet, which was found in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. This was through the use of camera traps. The unusual thing about this sighting was that the animal was seen only for a few days, recorded at one particular location and never seen after again. So being such a medium-sized mammal, we actually, it's quite surprising to find that we have not really been able to detect its presence easily. And also what happened to this particular individual is still a mystery. Okay, with that, I hand the time back to Kwek Yan.
Hey, thanks, Norman, for sharing with us your very fascinating work on these animals in our forests. So next, what I'll do is I'll be talking about how we translate this knowledge of forests into proper planning and applications to manage and enhance our habitats to better protect our natural heritage. So the National Parks Board has a Nature Conservation Master Plan, under which there are 4 key trusts. And the first trust is that we conserve key habitats in the form of nature reserves, such as the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. And as we've mentioned, these are the areas where we have our remaining primary forests, as well as the native-dominated secondary forests. But we also designate and manage nature parks that are around these nature reserves to serve as buffers, provide complementary habitats for flora and fauna, and also take some pressure off the nature reserves in terms of recreational use. Besides the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, there are still important forest habitats and forest patches in the western and northwestern parts of Singapore, such as the Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve, in the southern ridges, such as in Labrador Nature Reserve, and in the northeast, such as the mangroves in Pasir Ris, Pulau Ubin, and Pulau Tekong. So what we have to do is we have to try and connect these core areas of biodiversity through ecological connectivity enhancements to facilitate the movement of animals such as the pangolins, the colugos, and even the civets that Norman has talked about through Singapore's urban environment. So one such example of connectivity enhancement is the EcoLink at BKE, which is a bridge that was built across the Bukit Timah Expressway to reconnect the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, which were actually once connected as a continuous forest before the expressway was constructed in 1986. So you can see how the EcoLink is essentially a forested bridge and serves as the ecological corridor for wildlife. The pangolins that Norman talked about have been recorded through camera traps to be using this bridge, and some numbers have shown that actually pangolin roadkills have decreased after the EcoLink's construction. Some other connectivity enhancement you might see would include nature ways. In fact, you might have noticed that certain stretches of greenery near your home have become more lushly planted up and more colorful in recent years. Such stretches might well be one of our nature waves, which try to mimic the forest environment, if you remember the various layers that we talked about, right? By having more structural complexity and with plants chosen that attract wildlife and try to get them to move along these nature ways between habitats. After protecting key habitats, next we try to improve forest regeneration through restoration. There's already previously been a 1MillionTrees webinar on forest restoration, so I'll not go into too much detail in here, but essentially the nature parks around our nature reserves are mostly exotic dominated secondary forests. And restoration actions in these nature parks will include enhancement planting with native species and weeding to prevent aggressive exotic species from smothering seedlings and saplings. Aside from restoring our forest, we also try to bring some elements of the forest, the complexity, the chaos of the forest into the urban environment in some way. And the waterway along Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park is an example of naturalizing what was originally a straight concrete canal and planting up with riparian vegetation on both sides. So in normal times, residents nearby can enjoy the park. And in times of heavy rain, the waterway and plants perform the role of a floodplain that collect and discharge the excess water. And at the Jurong Lake Gardens, you will be able to see many species here used in the landscaping that come from the freshwater swamp forest, which is a forest type that is very rare in Singapore today. So aside from habitat level protection and restoration, we also target species in species recovery programs, where rare species such as the Singapore freshwater crab, which is what we call endemic to Singapore, which means that it is found nowhere else in the world, we propagate them and we breed them, and then we reintroduce them into their habitats following habitat enhancement. Plants are also included in our species recovery programs, which includes the Singapore ginger, which is also endemic and only known so far from Singapore and nowhere else. So there are special approaches when it comes to conserving plant species, because you can make many cuttings from a single plant and you can plant them elsewhere, such as in our nature ways and for reforestation. Or you can collect the seeds of plants and you can store them in what we call seed banks. This is the Singapore Botanic Gardens, the National Park Spot Seed Bank. These strategies for conservation have to be informed by evidence and research. Therefore, applied research is the third thrust of the Nature Conservation Master Plan. Before we can protect something, we must know what is there. Therefore, we conduct surveys of our nature reserves and parks to document the species that are present. And through these, we occasionally find new records for Singapore or rediscover species that have not been recorded for a very long time and were thought to be extinct. We monitor our conservation efforts using methods just like what Norman had mentioned, through camera traps, telemetric methods. And we try to see and collect information on how well these conservation efforts are working. So here are two videos from camera traps, one on the left showing the Raffles banded langur, the rarer of the two species of monkeys that are still left in Singapore, using a rope bridge to cross between the Central Catchment Nature Reserve and Thomson Nature Park across the old Upper Thomson Road. And the right shows a slow lorries using the EcoLink at BKE. So after collecting all these data, which also includes mapping of remaining forests and green spaces, we have to crunch the data to help us in our planning. And the National Parks Board have recently completed an ecological profiling exercise for Singapore to identify specific areas that could serve as important nodes in the movement of animals between habitats. One such area is Bukit Batok, which lies between the Tengah Forest area that is connected to the Western Catchment and the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve in the east. So Bukit Batok already has Bukit Batok Nature Park as well as Bukit Batok Town Park, which have patches of forest. And these will be beefed up in the future with new nature parks, nature ways, and park connectors to form a Bukit Batok Nature Corridor. And all these things, we do not want to do this alone. The fourth thrust of the Nature Conservation Master Plan involves getting other people involved also together with us in our work. We work with academics like Norman, his students from institutes of higher learning, as well as the nature community, who have areas of expertise that we can tap on and learn from. We also have citizen science programs such as Biodiversity Watch, and of course, the 1 Million Trees movement to get everyday Singaporeans and residents of Singapore involved in efforts such as restoration efforts, to get your hands dirty, playing around with soil, and removing invasive species from our nature reserves and nature parks. It is only with your support that we can continue to undertake all this work to safeguard and secure our precious remaining natural heritage. So that at the same time, while we have all these wonderful green spaces that can be enjoyed by everyone in the city and nature. So that's it for our sharing today. So I'll hand it back to Percy.
Thank you very much, Norman and Kwek Yan. I'm glad to hear that despite being highly urbanized, Singapore still have a very large diversity of green spaces, and that these green spaces are carefully selected, carefully conserved to create interconnected habitats for wildlife. Now, if you'd like to learn even more about these different shades of green in Singapore green spaces, you may check out this video, NParks explain different shades of green. You may scan the QR code or use the link that is being shared in the Zoom chat. Now, it seems like Rachel's Zoom account has been pinging with lots of questions, so we'll move on to Q&A. We may not have enough time to cover all the questions as posed to us, but we'll try our best. And thanks a lot for contributing this question. So for our first question, it's a bit of a loaded question. What makes a forest patch valuable? Maybe Norman, you would like to answer this question first?
Sure, thanks, Posim. Yeah, it is quite a loaded question. So first off, when we think about this term valuable, right, we might think of a monetary value. If we are sort of to think in that perspective, then this goes into the realm of ecosystem evaluation, where we start to really put monetary values for what a forest can provide for humans. And this is quite tricky because I guess as with any services that the ecosystem can provide, not everyone feels about the same concerning its value. But we do know that the forest patches are able to provide many things for us which are not very easily appreciated or not often appreciated. Recently, we know that forest patches can actually provide health benefits. People taking a stroll in the park may have lower blood pressure, for example, and this may have huge benefits which are difficult to measure and quantify. Kwek Yan, any thoughts on this?
So yeah, so Norman has talked about the kind of benefits that we enjoy from forests. But at the same time, of course, if you were to try and measure the value of forest in terms of its biodiversity, then there are also other ways in which we can try to estimate that. For example, we will look at whether it contains mostly native species and how many species is it a habitat for. Are there certain species that only use that kind of particular type of vegetation or that particular type of forest, and these species are rare or they are very low populations? Or perhaps certain patches are important in terms of their physical location. They happen to be at the right place and can serve as connectivity nodes and so on. So these are a different way of looking at the value of forests. And that's why eventually, what we try to do is we try to protect the forests that are most valuable in many different ways. The ones that contain most species, most native species, like the primary tropical rainforest. We also protect the forests that are enjoyed by people, such as the various kinds of nature parks and parks around Singapore that people visit. But at the same time, we also try to identify certain forests that, by being there, they are actually helping to ensure that the other forest patches are also in good ecological health. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Norman and Kwek Yan. So for our second question, this member of audience would like to know what are some important yet endangered native species in Singapore. I think there's quite a number of this, but maybe you'd like to give your favorite one. Kwek Yan, would you like to go first?
So yeah, there's 2,000 over native plant species in Singapore. If you really had to force me to choose my favorite, it would be this tree that is found in the freshwater swamp forest called the Copsia singaporensis. It has very pretty flowers, and the flowers are actually pin-shaped, shaped like a star. And the flowers are mostly white, but at the center of the flower is a circle of red. So it's actually the Singapore color, and it's the shape of a star, which is also the Singapore flag. And the name Copsia singaporensis also has the name Singapore. That makes me sound like very nationalistic, but just happens that I find that everything all just comes together, so it's quite nice, and it's actually quite rare. So it's only found in freshwater swamp forests of southern Johor and Singapore. So that is one of my favorite species. How about you, Norman?
For me, I would go for the understudied and nocturnal species. That's my passion, really, because not much is known about them. And why I say that also has relevance to this question, because this question has two parts to it, right? The importance and then the endangered part. So in order to find out what species are important, first we have to study them. We have to know what's their ecological role, what do they contribute in terms of their interaction with other species, or even some services or functions that they actually provide. But without studying them, we don't know whether they're important or not. And in my opinion, the nocturnal species has been really neglected. So for me, that's where my passion lies. Yeah. And then the second part that's in this question, the endangered part, to know whether things are endangered, first, we also have to study them. And this means we have to keep track of the numbers and look at the trends over time. So so these two aspects really sort of points towards the understudied nocturnal realm for me, especially even the mammals.
All right, thank you very much. If I have to choose a favorite one myself, I would say it would be the pangolin, because I was really sold by the photo of the baby pangolin clinging onto its mother's tail that we were showing just now, Norman. So thanks for showing that to me. All right, for this question, the audience would like to know how long will it take for a secondary forest to become like a primary forest, ecologically speaking?
So maybe I'll answer from the plant side. Maybe then Norman can answer from the animal side. So I guess, a typical way that a scientist will answer many of these questions is it depends, right? Actually, disturbances happen in forests, any forest, frequently, right? And once a disturbance occurs, then when the forest is recovering, it's called a secondary forest. So in primary forests, when there is a natural disturbance, such as disturbance by wind and so on, the disturbance tends not to be a very intensive or very severe one. And secondary regeneration will complete in decades. Maybe within 10 years, the canopy cover will have recovered. And then, within 60, 70 years, some of the tallest trees would have recovered their heights from the sapling stage. But human disturbances can be quite severe and can affect the ability of forests to regenerate. And then after that, it takes a very, very long time, such as some of the areas of secondary forests that we have in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, formerly from destructive gambia and pepper plantations. So the soil is severely degraded, the seed bank is exhausted, and secondary regeneration had to start from scratch, which means that it has to wait for seeds to arrive from elsewhere. And it's been about 100 years for some of these patches of forest, and they've not recovered to primary forest state. So depending on the state of the disturbance, it can take a very, very long time. Yeah. Norman, how about the animals?
So Kwek Yan has answered most of it really. I guess it really depends. And sometimes it's dependent on really what's around the neighboring landscape. So we cannot just be focused on the patch itself. So Kwek Yan has hinted at it really because things like seed bank. So the sources of all these new plants and animals, where do they have to come from? Where can they come from? So if this patch that has been disturbed, currently a secondary forest, and is nested within patches of primary forest, then we will think that you actually will recover much faster. And then if it's isolated and then surrounded by all urban landscapes, then it may never recover. We don't know. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, this audience member would like to know how effective exactly is the EcoLink across BKE. So have you all seen or know of any animals that have been using it? Maybe Norman, has your pangolins been using it?
So Kwek Yan has shared that just now for the EcoLink, the pangolin has been recorded to use it. Yeah. I'm not sure about the long-term studies that has been done. And I do suspect that monitoring is currently ongoing and will continue to take place at EcoLink just to understand more what is it, how has it been effective. Yeah.
Maybe let me pull out a rabbit from the hat or pull a slip of paper from my sleeve. There's actually been monitoring that's been occurring at the BKE EcoLink pre-construction and also post-construction. So from post-construction surveys, actually quite a number of butterfly species, 29 species of butterflies, 28 species of birds, 10 species of mammals, 1 species of reptile have been documented to actually use the EcoLink. And some species will include Sunda pangolin, which is what Norman has already talked about, the common palm civet, lesser mouse deer even, the slow loris, which is the video that I showed, and birds such as the emerald dove, straw-headed boo-boo, changeable hawk eagle, blue-winged pitta, brown bubuk owl, right? So all these have been actually documented to be using the EcoLink. So I think the monitoring still continues to see as the vegetation matures, with more and more animals use it.
Oh, that's good to hear that many animals are actually using the EcoLink, and it's a very important piece of connectivity between the main forest and BTNR forest. Okay. So another question is, how do you maintain the emergent layer in the forest? So just to put some context, the emergent layer refers to the trees that are actually going above the canopy. So yeah, Kwek Yan, sounds like your area of expertise.
Yeah, it's really a difficult thing because the emergent layers are the biggest trees, and the biggest trees means that they are the oldest trees, right? So structurally speaking, already, to reach that kind of height is a very, very difficult task for a tree. But the taller you are, then the more risk there are to you. Don't know if you know that Singapore is one of the areas with the highest incidences of lightning strikes, especially during the April-May period. There's lots of tropical storms in terms of lightning storms and all that occurring in Singapore. And when you're so tall and you're peaking above the canopy, you tend to be a natural target because you're the shortest path for the lightning to reach the ground. And therefore, lightning can actually kill a lot of these trees. So, in more urbanized areas such as the Singapore Botanic Gardens, it's possible to have these lightning conductors that you install on the trees to try and protect the trees from lightning. But it's difficult to do such a thing in the forest because that will entail some kind of construction which might actually disturb the forest. So very often the best thing that we can do is to try and to monitor these trees, right? To monitor the big trees, which are always of interest to us, and try to make sure that if there's anything that we can do in terms of managing tree health in the forest, we try to do that. But it's definitely a challenge to do so.
Okay. All right. So we have a few more questions that just came in, so they will not be on the slides. So this one, can you tell us more about the dominant plants in secondary forest?
Okay, so maybe I can share my slides from.
Sure.
Yeah. Give me a moment while I go to those slides. Right, I talked about 4 groups, right? So just to give everyone a bit of a cheat sheet on how to identify some of these plants, maybe, right? Okay, so I talked about the calophyllum. If you look at the calophyllum, right, it has these very fine leaves. I talked about the Garcinia. The Garcinias are easily recognized if you walk past a tree and there's a lot of yellow latex flowing out of the tree. A very good chance that tree is a Garcinia tree because the Garcinias have yellow latex. The calophyllum on the left here is actually very closely related to the Garcinias, right? They were once thought to be in the same family. So the calophyllum also tends to have a bit of a cream yellow colored latex. So these Garcinias that you see, the fruits are actually eaten by both mammals as well as birds. And that's why the Garcinias are so successful. Because they can actually be dispersed by the mammals and birds that are still in the forest. The calophyllums, their fruits, some of them tend to be a bit greenish, right? So that they tend to be large and greenish, so they're actually dispersed by bats instead. But some of them can turn a darker color, and then the darker color ones will be the ones that actually that will attract birds to come and disperse them. So when I mean dark color, I would mean something like what you see here in the color of the fruits of the Elaeocarpus, right? This very almost iridescent blue-black kind of color. So these are some of the colors that will attract birds to come and feed them. For the Elaeocarpus, you can easily recognize them because the leaf blade have tooth edges, and the leaf stalk what we call double knee. So it's actually kinked at the part of the leaf stalk that's attached to the stem and the part of the leaf stalk that's attached to the blade. So there's a bit of a two layers of kink and serrated edges. So there's only like 4 or 5 species of very common Elaeocarpus in Singapore. Again, all easily told apart. One fine day, if I can give a walk, I can teach people how to identify some of these Elaeocarpus and show off to your friends. Syzygium have these powder puff-like flowers, right? And like pom-pom-like flowers, right? Pollinated by insects, especially bees. And I told you about how some of them are eaten, and these are the jambus. But a lot of the forest species are not so easily eaten. They're called the kelat, right? The Malay name for them is called the kelat. Again, the syzygium is very easily recognized because the leaves come in pairs along the stem. And if you look closely along the margin of the leaves, you will see a vein running through the margin. That's why we call it intramarginal vein. So you see pairs of leaves at the intramarginal vein. Very, very, very likely you are seeing a syzygium. Again, you can show off, this is a syzygium. Okay. So I think that's the 4 groups. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to tell these groups of plants.
Thanks for the crash course on how to identify most trees in a secondary forest. So now I think everyone can boast that they can tell at least half of the species in forest. So our final question, we'll take one last one because we're running out of time. Very personal. How do you become a forest researcher? Maybe Norman, you'd like to share a story on how you become a researching forest animal.
So for me, I would say it started in the university days. So I was being exposed to sort of a volunteer project where I could really observe Colugos. But it was actually not in the forest, but it was at the Mandai area. So that started me thinking about this whole topic about ecology, and also looking into what is known about the Colugos. And it was quite surprising that despite this species being described more than 200 years ago, so widespread in terms of its distribution across Southeast Asia, not much is known about it. And before that, there was just only one study done on the Philippine species. And seeing that we have a quite healthy population in Singapore, so why not study it? Yeah. Then one thing led to another. Then subsequently along the way, while I was doing my master's, that's where pangolins started to be really featured quite highly as being a traffic mammal. And so again, another species that's not well studied. So I took the chance and tried to work on the species and find out more information that may potentially be helpful for its conservation. Yeah, so subsequently I work on other stuff, but it's essentially all the understudied species.
And thank you for exposing us to these lesser known mammal species. Maybe you'll inspire more people to go on the forest animal research route. All right, so we've come to the end. And once again, thank you, Norman and Kwek Yan, for making time to share with us on the many shades of green, and despite being so tied up with your busy schedule. And thank you to all of you on Zoom and on YouTube for being such great audiences today. With the 1 Million Trees movement and our city nature vision, we hope to involve more people in creating a greener city. Check out our website, trees.sg, and connect with us on NParks social media channels. You may also scan the QR code here to sign up for our mailing list. So a million thanks to everyone, and we really hope that you have a great day ahead. Thank you.